Hello world and welcome to this edition of Tech on Fire with Blaze. I'm Blaze Stewart, architect at Wonderlight, and today we're going to be looking at Azure Firewall. Hi guys, today we're going to be taking a look at Azure Firewall and how you can use this to help secure workloads on Azure and how you can use it to manage a wide array of firewalls across an entire Azure deployment. We're going to be looking at a very simple use case, but I think it'll help illustrate what we're really trying to get at. So first we're going to look at what it's intended for, and then we'll go over to the Azure portal and I'll show you how to set it up. So let's talk about how this thing is intended to be used. So typically Azure Firewall is set up on what we call a hub VNet, and then we'll have what we call spoke VNets that are running virtual machines and other kinds of workloads on those spoke VNets, and they'll connect back to the hub VNet by way of a VNet peering. And then what this allows us to do is to connect multiple spoke VNets together all back to the hub VNet by way of VNet peering. And then also sometimes in that hub VNet you'll have something like a VPN or an express route that connects it back to on-premise. So typically what you need in that hub VNet is something to orchestrate that traffic flow, and that's what Azure Firewall is built to do. So what you can't do on Azure out of the box is route traffic between a spoke VNet and a spoke VNet if they're both connected to a hub VNet. So with a firewall there or some kind of appliance, you can set up routing in that firewall, and it will allow you to communicate between different spokes or allow you to have traffic forwarded back to on-premise, or vice versa, have on-premise traffic back into your spoke VNets, depending on however you set that up. And I'll link put a link to a video that I've done on hub and spoke topology that will go in more depth on this if you so choose to check that out. But this is the basic architecture, what this is trying to do. So with this, what we can then do is we can allow traffic in through our firewall right here and have it come into our spoke VNet, or vice versa. We can have all our traffic going out through the firewall from our spoke VNet. You can also do things like take traffic from on-premise and force it out through the firewall, or use the firewall to expose traffic and then route that back across a VPN or an express route, depending on what you might do. Now that firewall does need a dedicated subnet according to the configuration, but you can also have other things inside your hub VNet. On an instant, for instance, you might have something like an Active Directory server running there, and you can have other shared resources that are up and running in that hub VNet that the firewall can also act as a front end for as well. So this is the basic concept of what this is trying to get at, but there are a couple of features that this has that I want to talk about as well. So what can Azure Firewall do in light of the slide we just looked at? One thing it can do is source netting. This is where you have a backend system that originates traffic, and what it can do with that traffic is take it and send it to Azure Firewall, and it will take the private IP of that and substitute the source IP of a given packet for the external IP address of the firewall, and then forward that out to the public internet so it can be routed to whatever destination it might be intended for. And then conversely, it can use destination routing as well. And this is where you can have traffic coming into the firewall, and then it will swap out the destination IP, which is typically the firewall's IP, for a backend IP address, and then it will forward that traffic onto the backend. And this usually is at a port level where it does this. And so source natting and destination natting are common features of firewall, and Azure Firewall supports those at scale. So it's a very reliable product for doing source and destination natting. And there's a lot of things you can do with that with Azure Firewall. You can do things like service tags, so you don't have to explicitly know what the IP addresses are. Rather, you can just assign a service tag to a destination or source, and then you can change the IP addresses without actually having to go update the firewall rule every single time. And that allows you to have some variability in some of the policies that you create with this. A couple of the things that it can do is have multiple public IP addresses. So this is a common feature of firewalls that allow you to have multiple public IP addresses homed to the same device, and then all the traffic can come into that same device, and then it can also do destination and source natting based on those public IP addresses as well. It does have threat intelligence baked into it, and this is the ability to sense when things are happening, such as an attack against your firewall, and it's able to detect these kinds of threats and then alert you based on them, or it can do denies based on these kinds of threats that are coming into your firewall, depending on what that threat might look like. And it's hooked into things like Azure Monitor, Azure Logging, so that you can monitor that and record those events in the event that you need to go back and research those, or if you want to apply some kind of proactive response to that, you can do that as well, other than what Azure Firewall provides with a standard deny if you so choose. And also you can do forest tunneling. And what forest tunneling allows us to do is to take traffic and basically take the traffic and force it over a VPN or an express route, and that will allow us to take the traffic and send it over that, so that it goes back over a VPN or from a VPN in the other direction out through Azure. And so having forest tunneling allows us to prevent outbound traffic from leaving a specific subnet or VNet or a VPN, and it can then force it back over a VPN or an express route, or the vice versa. It can go out through the firewall, but it allows us to control the entry and exit point of traffic onto a network through forest tunneling. So these are some of the features that come out of the box with Azure Firewall. So now I want to go to the Azure portal and take a look at this product, and I want to create an instance of it and then create some rules and just show you how it works. So I'm here in the Azure portal, and I want to create a resource for this. I've already created some resources for this demo, but I'm going to look at the portal to show you the options that you can create this with. So I'm going to select Firewall right here, and this is going to allow me to create an instance of Azure Firewall. And this is basically just going to walk me through a creation wizard. It's pretty straightforward. You basically just give it a resource group, a region, a name, and availability zones if you so choose for that. And then you can use a couple of options that I want to highlight here. Now, what you can do with this is you can use standard or premium. This just gives you better SLAs that you can have for the Azure Firewall, and it gives you the ability to also have more scalability as well than what the standard gives you. But in most cases, standard is probably going to be good enough for many things. And there's two firewall management policy editors that you can use, and the one that you probably should use just by default is use the firewall policy to manage this firewall. This is the classic manager. You can do everything inside the newer one that you can in the old one. So if this is greenfield, just go for the new one rather than the classic. And then you can set up a firewall policy in the portal right here. Basically what this is going to do is create a firewall policy. I'm going to show you how to do that in just a minute, but not do it here in the creation. And you can bind it to an existing VNet, or you can create a new one. But in any case, you need to have a dedicated dedicated subnet for it. That is one thing that's going to require you to have. So if you want to choose one, it's not, I don't have one selectable here, but you would create a new virtual network and you need to create a new subnet for it. And then you would need to get a new public IP address for the firewall. And if you want to enable forest tunneling or not, you can definitely do that. If you want to enable that feature, which is what I was talking about in the slides, I'm not going to be demoing that, so I'm going to disable that. And once you have that, you can go through the tags and then review and create it. Now, once the resource is created, it will show up inside of your resource group as a firewall, and then you can use that to actually do things with the firewall. So we'll go over and look at that resource now that it's been created. So here's my resource group. I have in this resource group a virtual machine that I'm using for my demo. Once I have the policy set up, and I also have two public IP addresses. Now, the first public IP address I have here is just one that I use to log into the virtual machine to get a web server installed. So I'm not going to be using this temp IP right here. I'm going to be using this firewall IP right here as part of my firewall, which is the resource that I created, and it's going to be associated with the firewall policy. So first thing I want to do is look at the VNet though, because the VNet is where all this stuff comes together. So this is my firewall policy, firewall subnet right here. And when I created the firewall, it created this subnet in this space for me, and so it's got an IP address and it's named Azure Firewall Subnet. That is what it's required to be named. So you cannot change that. That's just the name that it assigns to this, and then it will use this one for all the things that Azure Firewall does behind the scenes, and that is where that's all handled. And then you can have one or more other subnets in this VNet if you so choose. And I have my VNet VM on this subnet. I'm treating it like it was a shared VM across a bunch of different resources, but I'm showing you these subnets so that you can have an idea what I'm working with here. Now, if you don't already have firewall associated with it, this will be empty, but you can associate a firewall with the VNet, and that's where you would basically join those two together. Is when you create the firewall, either you create a new subnet and a new virtual network, or you can use an existing one. And if you use an existing one, when you create it, you have to put in what that firewall, that virtual network will be for that firewall, and this is where it's set up in this particular virtual network. Now, the actual firewall itself is right here, and this is the resource that gets deployed. And Azure Firewall, it looks like this. It's basically got the properties right here, and it'll show you the IP addresses, management subnets, etc. That if you need all this, you can turn that on. That's kind of outside the scope of what I'm talking about today. But with the firewall installed, you can basically see the configuration here. You can manage the public IP address, or you can add another one to it, so you can have multiple public IP addresses, and you can look at the diagnostic settings and logs and metrics, etc. right down here inside of monitoring. Now, I have enabled on this particular firewall manager to use the new experience, not the classic experience. If I was using the classic experience, I'd be able to create policies right here. But otherwise, I'm going to be using the firewall manager experience right here, and that's what's going to allow me to manage the policies that get applied universally across all the firewall instances that I might have on Azure. And they did this to kind of help consolidate the management of firewalls, because what folks were having were multiple firewalls that they were having to manage, and it was hard to do by having to go in each and every firewall. So they created the Azure Firewall Manager, so you had a central place to manage your firewalls, and then you can use this in conjunction with Azure Security Center as well. So it's a feature that's kind of built into Azure Security Center if you want to connect it to that as well. So for our experience, we're using Azure Firewall Manager. So visit the Azure Firewall Manager to set this stuff up. So to create a policy, what I need to do is come down here to Azure Firewall Policies. And I think there's a bug in this because it's actually showing the same policy over and over again. But this is where you create a policy. And to create a firewall policy, it's pretty straightforward if you're just doing things like SNAT or DNAT. And the policy itself is basically just where you set where the properties are going to be coming from. And so you choose the name and do these things right here. I'm going to give it, temp policy or something like that. And you can use this to temp dash policy. This got temp. Use this to create that. So standard is probably clear as well. What you can do with policies, though, is you can create policy hierarchies, or you can say this policy is a child policy of another policy. And what this allows us to do is to create hierarchies in policy, so that rules inside of a policy, a parent policy, can be applied to a child policy, and the child policy can then basically get the rules from the parent policy. But what will happen is the rules in the parent policy will supersede the rules in the child policy. So you need to kind of keep that in mind when you're creating these. In any case, you can, if you want to, create those policy hierarchies. Now, you can enable or disable DNS features right here. So if I enable this, it's going to ask me, custom DNS server or a DNS proxy, and you can enable that if you so choose. And it's going to tell you what's your DNS server. And you can enable that. That's for doing things like DNS lookups for whenever traffic's coming in based on FQDN type rules, if you so choose to use that feature. But I'm not going to be using for this particular policy. Now, if I have premium turned on, I can do TLS inspection, which basically validates certificates and so on, if you so choose to do that with. But it gives you the ability to look at the TLS certificates that are in play that are coming across the policy right there. This is where you can set up rules, and rules are where you have the port mappings as well as IP mappings, etc. added right here. So if I add a rule collection right here, this is where I'm going to add in my actual rules for port forwarding for basically source NATing or destination NATing, whatever that might be. So in this one, I have to give it a name. So my rule or something like that. You have to tell it, what kind of rule it is, network application or DNAT. I'm interested in DNAT rule, and you give it a priority 200 or something like that. And this is basically where you can set up IP address or IP groups. You can do IP groups if you so choose, or IP addresses based on a single IP address. So source type is IP address. The source can be anything. The protocol can be TCP, UDP, or both. And then the destination port, or ports plural, and the destination type would be an IP address. And then this is going to be the external IP address that you need for this. So if you wanted to bind this to a specific firewall, you need to get the IP address for that, the external IP address for that destination firewall right there, which in my case is going to be an Azure firewall. So I would need to go into my firewall and grab the firewall IP address, which is this one right here. And that's going to be the destination IP address for this DNAT rule. And the translated address is the backend address. And so I can set that to whatever that might be, 10.0.0.1, and that's not an actual IP address I'm using. But just to show you how to set these up, you can use also an alternate port if you so choose. But usually you're going to have the destination port and the translated port one and the same. However, you don't have to do that. If you want to do port mapping, you can do that as well as do the DNAT. So that basically gives me a rule, and it's basically balking at me because I have a problem right here. I need to give it a name, and it says my rule, and I can add that. And I have the rule now mapped right here, and then if you needed to, you can go back and edit those rules if you want to. Now in intelligent threat detection is this basically allows me to do IDPS from the parent policy, and this will allow me to do alerting or alert and deny on threat detection right here if I want to turn that on. And threat intelligence is what I can do for specific addresses if I want to set the filtering up. I can do it based on address ranges or subnets or even fully qualified domains if I want to do that as well. But I need to have the DNS enabled with reverse DNS in order to use that. So that's a feature you can turn on that gives you some hooks into something like Azure Monitor and Log Analytics, as well as Azure Security Center for doing threat analysis against stuff that's traversing your firewall right here. And then of course you can do tags, and once you have that, you can do a review and create. I'm not going to create this. I already have a rule in play. So if I go back over here in my firewall and I look at my my various rules, I can come over here and look at my one that I have created, which is this one right here. And it is basically just doing a DNAT, and it's just doing DNAT from a front-end IP to a back-end IP address. So that's the front-end IP address for my firewall. It's the back-end IP address on port 80. And this is doing DNAT right here. So you see I have other types of rules I can apply, network rules. I can do application rules if I so choose to do these. And these allow you to do things like application. You can use service tags and things like that for these kinds of rules as well. But all in all, they kind of all work the same way. It just basically, so here's my traffic, and here's what I want to do with that traffic. And DNAT is just doing forwarding traffic basically that traverses the firewall to a backend. And then if I want to set this up as the default route for all my virtual machines, I can have the traffic be forced out of this as well, and then I can set up filtering rules for that as well if I want to deny that kind of traffic. So all in all, it's a fairly rich ecosystem for doing things. Here's the secure virtual networks and the private SNAT range and so on, that if I wanted to set that up, I could do that. But now that I have this, basically what this rule is doing is creating a rule that's going to forward to my backend machine, which is this virtual machine right here. And it's just a Linux virtual machine that's running on a public IP address. So if I do this one right here, just to show you what this looks like, it's just running Nginx. So I'm nothing installed on that VM. It's just Nginx with the default page there. But I have also set my firewall up to forward to this as well. That's what that DNAT rule did through my firewall. But before I do that, there's one last thing you have to do with Azure policy to get it to connect to a firewall. So inside of our firewall policy, this is where I set the rules up, and this is where I have all of that. However, if I want to get a policy applied to it, I need to actually do an association between the firewall policy and the actual firewall itself, and that is done right here. So if you didn't have an associated policy, you would have to do an association right here. So if I wanted to change this, I could. But what you need to do is go into your firewall and associate a firewall policy with your firewall. And then you can edit the policy using Firewall Manager, but you have to bind the firewall policy inside the firewall so it applies to this particular firewall that I'm actually managing here. So once that's in play, everything should be good to go. So I should be able to come back over here to my VM, or sorry, to my firewall's IP address and connect to that back in web server using the public IP address, and that's what I'm seeing here. So this is the public IP address for my firewall, and it's doing the DNAT back into that VM like we saw already. So this is a basic setup for a firewall in Azure. Azure Firewall is very rich, and we've kind of just done an overview of the features and talked about what it can do and what it's intended for. The real value added to of Azure Firewall, again, is getting down into a lot of that threat detection and threat analysis that it can do with traffic traversing that. That's not something you're going to get with just the standard offerings on Azure, like a public IP address or something like an NSG or anything like that. So this gives you a little bit more value added to what you would get out of the box with Azure, just using something simple like an NSG or just a public IP address or something like that. So consider using this if you want to really tighten down the screws on your security posture on Azure.
If you like this content, please consider visiting us online at www.wintelect.com, and there you can find about services that Wintelect offers, including training and consulting services. Also, please consider subscribing to this channel by clicking on the subscribe button and clicking the bell icon to get notifications when new content becomes available, and also comment down below. You can also follow me on Twitter at @TheOneMule, and also follow Wintelect on Twitter at WintelectNow or at Wintelect. We are constantly posting things about Azure-related technologies and things related to software development. You can also reach us by email at consulting@wintelect.com. Until next time, thank you.